What if the thing you've spent years trying to get rid of isn't actually your enemy, but a messenger you never learned how to listen to? Sit with that idea for a moment, because we're going to take it apart slowly, and I promise that by the end of this video, you'll look at your own behavior with different eyes. Think about that habit you hate, the one you've sworn to quit 1,000 times, and that somehow keeps showing up when you least expect it. It could be a substance, it could be your phone, it could be food, it could be a relationship you know is hurting you and that you keep going back to anyway. It doesn't matter what specific shape it takes in your case. What matters is the feeling that comes with it. That exact mix of immediate relief and later shame. That cycle that repeats itself with almost mathematical precision, as if something inside you were following a script you never actually wrote. For years, we've been taught to understand addiction as simple lack of discipline, a flaw in character, a failure of willpower that gets fixed by gritting your teeth and saying no next time. And if you've ever tried to stop a compulsive behavior using only that strategy, you already know what happens. It works for a couple of days, sometimes a week, and then, without warning, the urge comes back stronger than before, as if pressure had been building up somewhere hidden the whole time you thought you had it under control. There's a deep reason why this happens, and it has absolutely nothing to do with how weak or strong you are as a person. It has to do with something that takes place far below the surface of your awareness, in a region of the mind that a Swiss psychiatrist named Carl Jung studied with a depth that still astonishes anyone who dives into his work today. And I want to warn you about something before we go on. What you're about to hear in the next few minutes might feel uncomfortable. We're going to talk about parts of yourself that you may have spent years avoiding looking at directly. But I promise that if you can sit with that discomfort until the end, you're going to understand your own behavior in a way that no shallow piece of willpower advice could ever have given you. Let's start with an uncomfortable question that almost no one dares to ask out loud. What if addiction weren't the problem itself, but the clumsy solution your mind came up with for a much deeper problem? I know it sounds contradictory. We're used to thinking of addiction as something that destroys, that drags you down, that ruins entire lives. And it does, in fact, do that. But Jung proposed looking at this phenomenon from a different angle, one that's rarely explained clearly. In his way of understanding the human psyche, any symptom, however destructive it looks from the outside, serves an internal function. It doesn't appear out of nowhere. It isn't a random glitch in the system. In most cases, it's a desperate attempt by the mind to resolve an imbalance that hasn't found any other way to express itself. Think of it like a fire alarm that won't stop going off in your house. You could, of course, rip the alarm off the wall so it stops bothering you. The noise would stop immediately, yes, but the fire that set it off would keep burning somewhere out of sight. Addiction, understood this way, works exactly like that alarm, a loud, uncomfortable, sometimes devastating warning that something is burning underneath and needs urgent attention. And this is where one of the most fascinating and least understood concepts in all of Jung's work comes in: the shadow. Jung used this word to refer to everything we reject in ourselves. We're not just talking about negative or shameful traits, although those are certainly included. We're talking about any emotion, desire, memory, or wound that at some point in your life became too painful, too unacceptable, or too dangerous to hold in plain daylight. When something like that happens, the mind doesn't erase it, because it actually can't. It pushes it down, burying it in a region of the psyche that stays outside everyday awareness, but that remains completely alive and active from down there. The problem, and it's essential that you understand this, is that whatever we bury never disappears. It simply stops being visible, and whatever isn't visible can't be consciously managed. It keeps pushing from below, looking for any crack it can slip through to reach the surface, even if it comes out indirectly, disguised, unrecognizable, even to the very person experiencing it. Imagine that as a child you learned, maybe without anyone ever saying it outright, that showing sadness made the people around you uncomfortable. Maybe a father tensed up whenever you cried. Maybe a mother changed the subject quickly whenever you tried to talk about something that hurt. No direct punishment was needed, no cruel words. That subtle reaction alone, repeated enough times, was enough for your child mind to draw a silent conclusion. This emotion isn't welcome here, it's better to hide it. That sadness didn't disappear, it simply learned to hide so well that today, many years later, you may not even recognize it when you're feeling it. But it's still there, pushing from below, looking for a way out, and one of the most effective escape routes the human brain has found for temporarily relieving that kind of buried pain is precisely addictive behavior. I want to pause here on a mechanism that's absolutely crucial for understanding why addiction becomes so hard to give up through willpower alone. Any addictive behavior, whatever specific form it takes, offers something no motivational talk can offer: immediate relief, a moment of emotional numbing, a pause, however brief, from an inner noise that would otherwise feel unbearable. The body learns this astonishingly fast. It doesn't need to be reasoned through. It doesn't even need to be conscious. The nervous system registers, again and again, that this particular behavior brings with it a sense of calm, of disconnection, of rest, from an inner tension that would otherwise keep growing unchecked. And once the body learns that association, it starts seeking it automatically, long before the conscious mind has any chance to step in with reasoning or resistance. This explains something you may have experienced yourself, without quite understanding why. The sense that the urge arrives before the thought does. One moment you're perfectly calm, and the next you're already in the middle of the very behavior you wanted to avoid, as if you'd woken up from a brief trance without remembering exactly how you got there. This isn't a character flaw. It's clear evidence that there's an automatic pattern operating far below the level where you normally believe you're in control. Jung had a specific term for this kind of pattern that seems to act on its own, almost as if it had its own independent will inside us. He called them autonomous complexes. A complex, in the sense Jung gave the word, is a cluster of emotions, memories, and beliefs that gather around a specific wound, and that over time gain so much inner force that they start behaving almost like a secondary personality within the main one. When that complex activates, it temporarily takes control of behavior, and the person acts in a way that, looking back afterward, they barely recognize as their own. Does that feeling sound familiar? Having acted as if possessed by something bigger than yourself, unable to stop, even though you knew perfectly well you were hurting your own life. That feeling isn't exaggerated or overly dramatic. It describes fairly accurately what happens when an autonomous complex temporarily takes the wheel. You're not crazy, you're not weak. For a moment, you're being driven by a part of your psyche that has been operating outside your awareness for a long time, desperately seeking the relief it never learned how to ask for in any other way. Now there's a second layer to this phenomenon that's even harder to face, one that almost no surface-level approach to addiction dares to mention clearly: identity. At first, when an addictive behavior starts to take hold, a person tends to think about it in fairly simple terms. I have a problem. I have a habit I need to control. But as time goes on, if that behavior repeats often enough, something much deeper starts to happen. The behavior stops being something the person does and becomes something the person is. The inner phrase shifts, almost without noticing, from "I have an addiction" to "I am an addict." And that small shift in language hides an enormous psychological transformation. When suffering becomes a central part of someone's identity, giving up the behavior stops being just a matter of changing a habit. On a much deeper level, it becomes a direct threat to their very sense of who they are. This explains a phenomenon that baffles a lot of people trying to help someone trapped in a destructive pattern. Sometimes the person seems to actively resist getting better, even while consciously insisting they want to change with all their heart. It isn't hypocrisy or dishonesty. It's that some part of the psyche genuinely perceives giving up that behavior as equivalent to ceasing to exist as it knows itself. Here I want to introduce a concept that was absolutely central to Jung in any process of deep transformation: symbolic death. We're obviously not talking about physical death. We're talking about something much subtler and, in its own way, just as terrifying to the psyche: the disappearance of an entire identity. For a new way of living to be born, the old identity built around suffering has to stop existing, And any part of us, however objectively harmful it is, resists disappearing with everything it has, because from its own internal logic, disappearing is equivalent to total annihilation. This explains why so many genuine recovery processes go through, at some point, a phase of deep emptiness. When the addictive behavior starts to loosen its grip, a new life full of meaning doesn't immediately arrive to replace it. What arrives first is a strange silence, an absence, a sense of not quite knowing who you are, once that behavior, the one that for so long organized your days, filled the gaps, and provided a constant excuse to avoid facing other, deeper questions about your own existence, is no longer there. That emptiness is deeply frightening, and many people, once they reach that point, feel an almost irresistible urge to turn back. Not because the previous behavior was actually satisfying, but because at least it was familiar. At least it offered a recognizable identity, even if a painful one. Given the choice between familiar suffering and unfamiliar freedom, human beings surprisingly often choose familiar suffering. Not out of masochism, but because the unknown triggers a fear that's even older and deeper than the pain of the addiction itself. I want you to understand something with total clarity at this point in the video, because it's probably the single most important idea we'll share today. That emptiness that shows up when you let go of an addictive behavior isn't a sign that something is going wrong. It's actually a sign that the process is working exactly as it should. It's the necessary space between the death of an old identity and the birth of a new one. You can't jump straight from one to the other without passing through that uncomfortable territory in between. Now let's go back to the question I raised at the start of the video, because I want you to look at it now with a much deeper understanding. What part of you needs this behavior, and what exactly is it trying to relieve? This question completely changes the way you can approach any recovery process. Instead of pouring all your energy into fighting the symptom head-on, it invites you to look underneath, toward the wound the symptom is trying to soothe. This doesn't mean, in any way, that you should stop working on changing the behavior itself. It means that fighting it, without understanding what's underneath, tends to be exhausting, and, all too often, temporary. Think of any compulsive behavior you know closely, whether it's your own or someone else's. Behind that behavior, there's almost always a legitimate need, even if it's being met in a way that ends up causing more harm than relief. It might be the need to feel accompanied in the face of unbearable loneliness. It might be the need to feel something, anything, in the face of an emotional numbness that's been in place for years. It might be the need to escape, even for a few minutes, from an inner self-criticism so fierce it becomes impossible to bear without any kind of break. Seen this way, addictive behavior is nothing more than a deeply human, if destructive, attempt to satisfy a real emotional need using the only tool that happened to be available at the time. This doesn't excuse the behavior or erase its consequences, but it radically changes the relationship you can build with yourself during the process of change. It's no longer about hating a part of yourself for being weak or flawed. It's about approaching, with genuine curiosity, a part of you that has spent a long time trying, in the only way it knew how, to keep you afloat in the middle of a pain you may never have learned to name directly. Now I want to talk about another aspect Jung considered absolutely essential in any deep psychological transformation process: integration. It's very common to think that the solution to a harmful part of ourselves is to eliminate it completely, to expel it, to destroy it at the root. Jung argued exactly the opposite. In his understanding of the psyche, any attempt to forcibly eliminate a part of yourself, instead of consciously integrating it, tends to strengthen that part rather than weaken it, because it pushes it even further into the shadow, where it keeps operating outside conscious control, now with more resentment and more urgency to make itself known somehow. Integrating, in this context, doesn't mean accepting the destructive behavior or resigning yourself to repeating it. It means openly recognizing the legitimate need hiding underneath, giving it a conscious space in your life, and starting to look for healthier ways to meet that same need. If the addictive behavior was soothing deep loneliness, integration means deliberately building genuine connections that can hold that need for closeness without destroying your life in the process. If it was numbing an old emotional wound, Integration means finding safe spaces where that pain can finally be felt, named, and processed, instead of continuing to push it down indefinitely. This process isn't fast, and it would be dishonest of me to promise you otherwise. The psyche doesn't negotiate shortcuts, but every time you manage to precisely name the need behind a specific urge, you strip away a small piece of its automatic power. You stop being entirely at the mercy of the autonomous complex, and you start reclaiming, however gradually, the ability to choose consciously instead of reacting blindly. Now I want to tell you about something very concrete, something you can start practicing today, even though it won't, on its own, resolve a process that in most cases also requires qualified professional support. The next time you feel the urge to turn to the behavior you want to change, instead of fighting it head-on, try pausing for a moment and asking yourself, with total honesty and without judgment, exactly what you're feeling right before the urge shows up. Not what you're thinking, but what you're feeling in your body. A tightness in your chest, a hollow feeling in your stomach, a restlessness you can't quite name. That instant, that brief gap between the original emotion and the automatic behavior that follows it, is exactly where any real possibility for change begins. Most people live through that process completely automatically, with no conscious pause at all between emotion and action. Learning to insert, even for a few seconds, a moment of observation in the middle of that automatic process is, according to numerous current therapeutic approaches that draw directly from Jung's ideas, one of the most powerful steps that exist for starting to regain control over a pattern that seemed completely uncontrollable for years. I also want to talk about the role the body plays in all of this, because it tends to be completely overlooked in most conversations about addiction and behavior change. A behavior repeated for long enough stops being just a mental decision and becomes a learned bodily pattern. The body memorizes rituals, sequences, specific gestures tied to the addictive behavior, to the point where certain settings, certain times of day, certain smells, or places can trigger the urge even before the conscious mind has had time to step in. This means real change doesn't happen only at the level of thought. It also requires changing the physical environment, the daily rituals, the bodily routines that supported the previous behavior. Deciding mentally to stop doing something isn't enough if the body keeps being pushed, day after day, toward the same automatic triggers that activated the pattern in the first place. Now I want to address something that might be painful to hear, but that I consider essential for anyone going through a process like this, or supporting someone who is. This path isn't linear. There's no straight line from destructive behavior to complete liberation. There are advances, setbacks, relapses that sometimes feel like total failures, even though they're actually an almost inevitable part of any deep psychological transformation. Each relapse, seen through the understanding we've built throughout this video, doesn't necessarily represent a total failure of the process. Instead, it can represent an incredibly valuable opportunity to see more clearly which specific need still wasn't being adequately met, rather than using the relapse as an excuse for destructive self-criticism, which, on top of everything, tends to feed the very same emotional pain that caused the behavior in the first place. It's possible to use it as information. What was happening right before? What emotional need went unmet? What part of the shadow is still pushing from below, waiting to be recognized in a different way? I want to close this video with a reflection I consider essential, one that in some way sums up everything we've walked through together so far. For a long time, you've probably tried to treat your own destructive behavior as if it were an outside invader, something foreign to you that needs to be fought, expelled, defeated through sheer willpower. And that strategy, understandable as it is, usually ends up creating an exhausting inner war, in which one part of you fights endlessly against another part of you, with neither side ever managing a final victory. There's another way to understand this process, one that demands far more inner honesty, but that also holds far more promise in terms of lasting results. It consists of no longer seeing that behavior as an outside enemy, and instead starting to see it as a wounded part of yourself that, for years, tried, in the only way it knew how, to keep you safe from a pain that was unbearable to hold in full awareness. That part doesn't need to be destroyed. It needs to be listened to, understood, and finally guided toward a different, healthier way of meeting the same legitimate need it was always trying to fulfill. This doesn't mean change is simple, or that you can resolve it just by changing the way you think about it. It means the real road to freedom doesn't run through a war against yourself, but through a much deeper process of inner knowledge, integration of the rejected parts, and patient reconstruction of an identity that no longer needs to organize itself around suffering in order to stand on its own. If you've made it this far, something we've talked about today probably resonates with you in a way you didn't expect when you started this video. Maybe, at some point along the way, you recognized a piece of your own story. And if that's the case, I want you to hold on to this final idea, because I think it captures the heart of everything Jung tried to teach us throughout his entire body of work. Whatever we reject in ourselves never disappears simply because we deny it. It only waits, in silence, for a chance to finally be understood. And the day you decide to stop fighting that part of yourself and instead start asking it what it actually needs, is the day the real process of reclaiming your own life begins. Transformation doesn't arrive all at once, and it doesn't come from a single video or from a single decision made in a passing moment of motivation. It arrives, little by little, every time you choose to observe instead of react, every time you choose to understand instead of punish, every time you decide to look directly at what you spent so long trying not to see. Before we finish, I want to tell you about a phenomenon that tends to go completely unnoticed, and that's nevertheless key to understanding why so many people, after seemingly overcoming a destructive behavior, end up replacing it with a different one, sometimes even more damaging than the original. Jung explained it with an idea that's very simple to state, though deeply uncomfortable to accept. If the original wound is never attended to, the symptom will change shape, but the function it served will remain intact. This explains a pattern you've probably noticed, in yourself or in someone close to you, without quite knowing how to name it. Someone leaves a substance behind and, almost without realizing it, starts developing a compulsive relationship with work, or with exercise, or with a romantic relationship that becomes unhealthily consuming. From the outside, it might look like a positive change, even an admirable one, but if the underlying function stays the same, that is, if the new behavior is still serving the role of numbing the same original wound, no genuine transformation has actually taken place. The pattern has simply changed the disguise it uses to survive. This is why an approach focused only on eliminating the visible behavior without ever working on the wound holding it up from below tends to fail sooner or later, even if that failure sometimes takes years to become clear. Understood this way, addiction is much less like a stain that can be wiped off the surface, and much more like a root that stays alive underground, capable of sprouting again somewhere else in the garden if it isn't dealt with directly. I also want to mention something Jung developed extensively throughout his work that's especially relevant here: the difference between suffering that destroys and suffering that transforms. These aren't the same experience, even though from the outside they can look very similar. Suffering that destroys is suffering lived in total isolation, with no understanding or meaning at all. Pain that simply happens again and again without leading anywhere. Suffering that transforms, on the other hand, is suffering that's moved through with awareness, with support, with a genuine willingness to draw some kind of understanding from the experience, however painful it is. This distinction matters enormously, because a lot of people, when they hear talk of integrating the shadow or facing buried pain, imagine the path simply means suffering more, exposing themselves carelessly to all the pain that's built up over the years. Nothing could be further from what Jung actually proposed. The process of individuation doesn't aim to maximize suffering. It aims to give it meaning and to hold it safely, usually alongside a qualified professional who can support the process without the person becoming completely overwhelmed. It's essential to be clear on this point. Nothing we've talked about today is meant to replace the professional support needed in processes involving severe addiction. Jungian psychology offers a deeply valuable framework for understanding, but understanding the origin of a pattern doesn't automatically mean you can resolve it alone, especially when real physical dependence is involved. If you're in the middle of a process like this, seeking professional help isn't a sign of weakness or personal failure. In fact, it's exactly the kind of conscious, courageous action we've been talking about throughout this entire video. There's one last idea I want to leave you with before closing, because I think it best captures the spirit of everything Jung tried to convey throughout his entire professional life. He held that there is no light without shadow, and that any attempt to build an identity that's entirely clean, entirely positive, entirely free of uncomfortable parts, inevitably ends up creating an even bigger and more dangerous shadow, precisely because it's denied any chance of conscious expression. The most whole people, in his understanding of the human psyche, aren't the ones who manage to fully eradicate their dark parts, but the ones who learn to know them, to give them a conscious place, and to stop being ruled by them from the shadows. Maybe the question you should walk away with at the end of this video isn't exactly, how do I get rid of this behavior for good, but a slightly different and considerably more honest question. What part of me has been trying to survive through this behavior, and what does it actually need from me now in order to start healing in a different way? That's the real beginning of any genuine psychological rebirth, and that possibility, however distant it may seem right now, remains available to you at any moment you decide to start walking toward it. If you made it to the end of this video, comment, "I made it," and I'll personally reply to you myself. And if this resonated with you, subscribe to be part of it, and hit like if you enjoyed it.